The tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, commonly known as the Spanish Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition Española, was established in 1478 by the Catholic monarchs, King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile. It began toward the end of the Reconquista and was intended to maintain Catholic orthodoxy in their kingdoms and to replace the medieval Inquisition, which was under papal control. It became the most substantive of the three different manifestations of the wider Catholic Inquisition along with the Roman Inquisition and Portuguese Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition may be defined broadly as operating in Spain and in all Spanish colonies and territories, which included the Canary Islands, the Kingdom of Naples, and all Spanish possessions in North, Central, and South America. According to modern estimates, around 150,000 people were prosecuted for various offences during the 3-century duration of the Spanish Inquisition, of whom between 3,000 and 5,000 were executed. The Inquisition was originally intended primarily to identify heretics among those who converted from Judaism and Islam to Catholicism. The regulation of the faith of newly converted Catholics was intensified after the royal decrees issued in 1492 and 1502 ordering Jews and Muslims to convert to Catholicism or leave Castile, resulting in hundreds of thousands of forced conversions, the persecution of conversos and Moriscos, and the mass expulsions of Jews and of Muslims from Spain. The Inquisition was abolished in 1834, during the reign of Isabella II, after a period of declining influence in the preceding century. The Inquisition was created through papal bull, ad abulendum, issued at the end of the 12th century by Pope Lucius III to combat the Albigensian heresy in southern France. There were a large number of tribunals of the Papal Inquisition in various European kingdoms during the Middle Ages through different diplomatic and political means. In the Kingdom of Aragon, a tribunal of the Papal Inquisition was established by the Statute of Excommunicamus of Pope Gregory IX, in 1232, during the era of the Albigensian heresy, as a condition for peace with Aragon. The Inquisition was ill received by the Aragonese, which led to prohibitions against insults or attacks on it. Rome was particularly concerned that the Iberian Peninsula's large Muslim and Jewish population would have a heretical influence on Catholic population. Rome pressed the kingdoms to accept the Papal Inquisition after Aragon. Navarre conceded in the 13th century and Portugal by the end of the 14th, though its Roman Inquisition was famously inactive. Castile refused steadily, trusting in its prominent position in Europe and its military power to keep the Pope's interventionism in check. By the end of the Middle Ages, England, due to distance and voluntary compliance, and the Castile, due to resistance and power, were the only Western European kingdoms to successfully resist the establishment of the Inquisition in their realms. Medieval Inquisition in Aragon. Although Raymond of Peñafort was not an inquisitor, James I of Aragon had often consulted him on questions of law regarding the practices of the Inquisition in the king's domains, since Peñafort was a canon lawyer and royal advisor. He lawyer's deep sense of justice and equity, combined with the worthy Dominican's sense of compassion, allowed him to steer clear of the excesses that were found elsewhere in the formative years of the Inquisitions into heresy. Despite its early implantation, the Papal Inquisition was greatly resisted within the Crown of Aragon by both population and monarchs. With time, its importance was diluted, and, by the middle of the 15th century, it was almost forgotten, although still there according to the law. Regarding the living conditions of minorities, the kings of Aragon and other monarchies imposed some discriminatory taxation of religious minorities, so false conversions were a way of tax evasion. In addition to the above discriminatory legislation, Aragon had laws specifically targeted at protecting minorities. For example, crusaders attacking Jewish or Muslim subjects of the King of Aragon while on their way to fight in the Reconquest were punished with death by hanging. Up to the 14th century, the census and wedding records show an absolute lack of concern with avoiding intermarriage or blood mixture. Such laws were now common in most of Central Europe. Both the Roman Inquisition and neighboring Christian powers showed discomfort with Aragon's law and lack of concern with ethnicity, but to little effect. High-ranking officials of Jewish religion were not as common as in Castile, but were not unheard of either. Abraham Zacuto was a professor at the University of Cartagena. Vidalestri was the royal silversmith for Ferdinand II of Aragon and conducted business in his name. And King Ferdinand himself was said to have remote Jewish ancestry on his mother's side. Medieval Inquisition in Castile. There was never a tribunal of the Papal Inquisition in Castile, nor any Inquisition during the Middle Ages. Members of the episcopate were charged with surveillance of the faithful and punishment of transgressors, always under the direction of the king. During the Middle Ages in Castile, the Catholic ruling class and the population paid little or no attention to heresy. Castile did not have the proliferation of anti-Jewish pamphlets as England and France did during the 13th and 14th centuries, and those that had been found were modified, watered-down versions of the original stories. Jews and Muslims were tolerated and generally allowed to follow their traditional customs in domestic matters. The legislation regarding Muslims and Jews in Castilian territory varied greatly, becoming more intolerant during the period of great instability and dynastic wars that occurred by the end of the 14th century. Castilian law is particularly difficult to summarize since, due to the model of the free royal villas, mayors and the population of border areas had the right to create their own fueros that varied from one villa to the next. In general, the Castilian model was parallel to the initial model of Islamic Spain. Non-Catholics were subject to discriminatory legislation regarding taxation and some other specific discriminatory legislation, such as a prohibition on wearing silk or flashy clothes, that varied from county to county, but were otherwise left alone. Forced conversion of minorities was against the law, and so was the belief in the existence of witchcraft, oracles or similar superstitions. In general, all people from the book were permitted to practice their own customs and religions as far as they did not attempt proselytizing on the Christian population. Jews particularly had surprising freedoms and protections compared with other areas of Europe and were allowed to hold high public offices such as the counselor, treasurer or secretary for the crown. During most of the medieval period, intermarriage with converts was allowed and encouraged. Intellectual cooperation between religions was the norm in Castile. Some examples are the Toledo School of Translators from the 11th century. Jews and Moors were allowed to hold high offices in the administration. See Abraham Sr., Samuel Oliva Abulafia, Isaac Abarbanel, López de Conchilos, Miguel Pérez de Olmezan, Jaco of Ben-Nun and Fernando del Pulgar. A tightening of the laws to protect the right of Jews to collect loans during the medieval crisis was one of the causes of the revolt against Peter the Cruel and catalyst of the anti-Semitic episodes of 1391 in Castile, a kingdom that had shown no significant anti-Semitic backlash to the Black Death and drought crisis of the early 14th century. Even after the sudden increase in hostility towards other religions that the kingdom experienced after the 14th century crisis, which clearly worsened the living conditions of non-Catholics in Castile, it remained one of the most tolerant kingdoms in Europe. The kingdom had serious tensions with Rome regarding the Church's attempts to extend its authority into the kingdom. A focus of conflict was Castilian resistance to truly abandon the Mozarabic rite, and the refusal to grant papal control over reconquest land. These conflicts added to a strong resistance to allowing the creation of an Inquisition, and the kingdom's general willingness to accept heretics seeking refuge from prosecution in France. Creation of the Spanish Inquisition. There are several hypotheses of what prompted the creation of the tribunal after centuries of tolerance. The two multi-religious hypothesis. The Spanish Inquisition is interpretable as a response to the multi-religious nature of Spanish society following the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim Moors. After invading in 711, the Moors controlled large areas of the Iberian Peninsula until 1250. Afterwards they were restricted to Granada, which fell in 1492. The Reconquista did not result in the total expulsion of Muslims from Spain, since they, along with Jews, were tolerated by the ruling Christian elite. Large cities, especially Seville, Valladolid, and Barcelona, had significant Jewish populations centered on Juderia, but in the coming years the Muslims became increasingly alienated and relegated from power centers. Post-Reconquest medieval Spain has been characterized by Americo Castro as a society of relatively peaceful coexistence punctuated by occasional conflict among the ruling Catholics and the Jews and Muslims. As historian Henry Carman notes, The so-called convivencia was always a relationship between unequals. Despite their legal inequality, there was a long tradition of Jewish service to the Crown of Aragon, and Jews occupied many important posts, both religious and political. Castile itself had an unofficial rabbi. Ferdinand's father John II named the Jewish Abertharch as court astronomer. Anti-Semitic attitudes increased all over Europe during the late 13th century and throughout the 14th century. England and France expelled their Jewish populations in 1290 and 1306 respectively. At the same time, during the Reconquista, Spain's anti-Jewish sentiment steadily increased. This prejudice climaxed in the summer of 1391 when violent anti-Jewish riots broke out in Spanish cities like Barcelona. To linguistically distinguish them from non-converted or long-established Catholic families, new converts were called conversos, or New Catholics. This event must be understood in the context of the fierce civil war and new politics that Peter the Cruel had brought to the land, and not be confused with spontaneous anti-Semitic reactions to the plague scene in northern Europe. According to Don Husdai Crescas, persecution against Jews began in earnest in Seville in 1391, on the first day of the lunar month Tammuz. From there the violence spread to Córdoba, and by the 17th day of the same lunar month, it had reached Toledo, called then by Jews after its Arabic name Chile, in the region of Castile. Then the violence spread to Mallorca, and by the first day of the lunar month Elul it had also reached the Jews of Barcelona in Catalonia, where the slain were estimated at 250. Indeed, many Jews who resided in the neighboring provinces of Lerida and Jinda and in the Kingdom of Valencia had also been affected, as were also the Jews of Al-Andalus. While many died a martyr's death, others converted to save themselves. Encouraged by the preaching of Ferran Martínez, Archdeacon of Écija, the general unrest affected nearly all of the Jews in Spain, during which time an estimated 200,000 Jews changed their religion or else concealed their religion, becoming known in Hebrew as anusim, meaning, those who are compelled. Only a handful of the more principal persons of the Jewish community, those who had found refuge among the viceroys in the outlying towns and districts, managed to escape. Forced baptism was contrary to the law of the Catholic Church, and theoretically anybody who had been forcibly baptized could legally return to Judaism. Legal definitions of the time theoretically acknowledged that a forced baptism was not a valid sacrament, but confined this to cases where it was literally administered by physical force. A person who had consented to baptism under threat of death or serious injury was still regarded as a voluntary convert, and accordingly forbidden to revert to Judaism. After the public violence, many of the converted felt it safer to remain in their new religion. Thus, after 1391, a new social group appeared and were referred to as conversos or New Christians. Many conversos, now freed from the anti-Semitic restrictions imposed on Jewish employment, attained important positions in 15th century Spain, including positions in the government and in the church. Among many others, physicians Andrés Legner and Francisco López de Villalobos, writers Juan de Encina, Juan de Mena, Diego de Valera and Alonso de Palencia, and bankers Luis de Santangel and Gabriel Sanchez were all conversos. Conversos, not without opposition, managed to attain high positions in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, at times becoming severe detractors of Judaism. Some even received titles of nobility and, as a result, during the following century some works attempted to demonstrate many nobles of Spain were descended from Israelites. At a time when most of Europe had already expelled the Jews from the Christian kingdoms, the dirty blood of Spaniards was met with open suspicion and contempt by the rest of Europe. As the world became smaller and foreign relations became more relevant to stay in power, this foreign image of being the seed of Jews and Moors may have become a problem. In addition, the coup that allowed Isabella to take the throne from Joanna of Avis and the Catholic monarchs to marry had estranged Castile from Portugal, its historical ally, and created the need for new relationships. Similarly, Aragon's ambitions lay in control of the Mediterranean and the defense against France. As their policy of royal marriages proved, the Catholic monarchs were deeply concerned about France's growing power and expected to create strong dynastic alliances across Europe. In this scenario, the Iberian reputation of being too tolerant was a problem. Despite the prestige earned through the reconquest, the foreign image of Spaniards coexisted with an almost universal image of heretics and bad Christians, due to the long coexistence between the three religions they had accepted in their lands. Anti-Jewish stereotypes created to justify or prompt the expulsion and expropriation of the European Jews were also applied to Spaniards in most European courts, and the idea of them being greedy, gold-thirsty, cruel and violent due to the Jewish and Moorish blood was prevalent in Europe before America was discovered by Europeans. Chronicles by foreign travelers circulated through Europe, describing the tolerant ambience reigning in the court of Isabella and Ferdinand, and how Moors and Jews were free to go about without anyone trying to convert them. Past and common clashes between the Pope and the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula regarding the Inquisition in Castile's case and regarding South Italy in Aragon's case also reinforced their image of heretics in the international courts. These accusations and images could have direct political and military consequences at the time, especially considering that the union of two powerful kingdoms was a particularly delicate moment that could prompt the fear and violent reactions from neighbors, even more if combined with the expansion of the Ottoman Turks on the Mediterranean. The creation of the Inquisition and the expulsion of both Jews and Moriscos may have been part of a strategy to whitewash the image of Spain and ease international fears regarding Spain's allegiance. In this scenario, the creation of the Inquisition could have been part of the Catholic monarch's strategy to turn away from African allies and towards Europe, a tool to turn both actual Spain and the Spanish image more European and improve relations with the Pope. The creation of the Spanish Inquisition was consistent with the most important political philosophers of the Florentine school, with whom the kings were known to have contact: Guicciardini, Pico della Mirandola, Machiavelli, Segni, Pitti, Nardi, Varchi, etc. Both Guicciardini and Machiavelli defended the importance of centralization and unification to create a strong state capable of repelling foreign invasions, and also warned of the dangers of excessive social uniformity to the creativity and innovation of a nation. Machiavelli considered piety and morals desirable for the subjects, but not so much for the ruler, who should use them as a way to unify its population. He also warned of the nefarious influence of a corrupt church in the creation of a selfish population and middle nobility, which had fragmented the peninsula and made it unable to resist either France or Aragon. German philosophers at the time were spreading the importance of a vassal sharing the religion of their lord. The Inquisition may have just been the result of putting these ideas into practice. The use of religion as a unifying factor across a land that was allowed to stay diverse and maintain different laws in other respects, and the creation of the Inquisition to enforce laws across it, maintain said religious unity and control the local elites were consistent with most of those teachings. Alternatively, the enforcement of Catholicism across the realm might indeed be the result of simple religious devotion by the monarchs. The recent scholarship on the expulsion of the Jews leans towards the belief of religious motivations being at the bottom of it. But considering the reports on Ferdinand's political persona, that is unlikely the only reason. Ferdinand was described, among others, by Machiavelli, as a man who didn't know the meaning of piety, but who made political use of it and would have achieved little if he had really known it. He was Machiavelli's main inspiration while writing The Prince. Other hypotheses that circulate regarding the Spanish Inquisition's creation include economic reasons, since one of the penalties that the Inquisition could enforce on the convicts was the confiscation of their property, which became crown property. It has been stated that the creation of the Inquisition was a way to finance the crown. There is no solid reason for this hypothesis to stand alone, nor for the kings of Spain to need an institution to do this gradually instead of confiscating property through edicts. But it may be one of the reasons why the Inquisition stayed for so long. This hypothesis notes the tendency of the Inquisition to operate in large and wealthy cities and is favored by those who consider that most of those prosecuted for practicing Judaism and Islam in secret was actually innocent of it. Gustave Bugenroth, editor and translator of the Spanish State Papers 1485-1509, believed that revenue was the incentive for Ferdinand and Isabella's decision to invite the Inquisition into Spain. Other authors point out that both monarchs were very aware of the economic consequences they would suffer from a decrease in population. Intolerance and racism. This argument is usually made regarding the expulsion of the Jews or the Moriscos, and since the Inquisition was so closely interconnected with those actions can be expanded to it. It varies between those who deny that Spain was really that different from the rest of Europe regarding tolerance and open-mindedness, and those who argue that it used to be, but gradually the anti-Semitic and racist atmosphere of medieval Europe rubbed onto it. It explains the creation of the Inquisition as the result of exactly the same forces than the creation of similar entities across Europe. This view may account for the similarities between the Spanish Inquisition and similar institutions, but completely fails to account for its many unique characteristics, including its time of appearance and its duration through time, so even if accepted requires the addition of some of the other hypotheses to be complete. Purely religious reasons. Essentially, this view suggests that the Catholic monarchs created the Inquisition to prosecute heretics and sodomites because the Bible says so. A common criticism that this view receives is that the Bible also condemns greed, hypocrisy, and adultery, but the Inquisition was not in charge of prosecuting any of those things. It also did not prosecute those who did not go to Mass on Sunday or otherwise broke the Catholic rituals as far as it was out of simple laziness. Considering this double standard, its role was probably more complex and specific. Start of the Inquisition. Fray Alonso de Ojeda, a Dominican friar from Seville, convinced Queen Isabella of the existence of crypto-Judaism among Andalusian conversos during her stay in Seville between 1477 and 1478. A report, produced by Pedro González de Mendoza, Archbishop of Seville, and by the Segovian Dominican Tomás de Torquemada, of Converso family himself, corroborated this assertion. Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella requested a papal bull establishing an Inquisition in Spain in 1478. Pope Sixtus IV granted a bull permitting the monarchs to select and appoint 2 or 3 priests over 40 years of age to act as inquisitors. In 1483, Ferdinand and Isabella established a state council to administer the Inquisition with the Dominican friar Tomás de Torquemada acting as its president, even though Sixtus IV protested the activities of the Inquisition in Aragon and its treatment of the conversos. Torquemada eventually assumed the title of Inquisitor General. Thomas F. Madden describes the world that formed medieval politics. The Inquisition was not born out of the desire to crush diversity or oppress people. It was rather an attempt to stop unjust executions. Yes, you read that correctly. Heresy was a crime against the state. Roman law in the Code of Justinian made it a capital offense. Rulers, whose authority was believed to come from God, had no patience for heretics. Ferdinand II of Aragon pressured Pope Sixtus IV to agree to an Inquisition controlled by the monarchy by threatening to withdraw military support at a time when the Turks were a threat to Rome. The Pope issued a bull to stop the Inquisition but was pressured into withdrawing it. On the 1st of November 1478, Sixtus published the papal bull, Exigit Sinceras Devotionis Affectus, through which he gave the monarchs exclusive authority to name the inquisitors in their kingdoms. The first 2 inquisitors, Miguel de Murillo and Juan de San Martin, were not named until 2 years later, on the 27th of September 1480 in Medina del Campo. The first auto de fe was held in Seville on the 6th of February 1481, 6 people were burned alive. From there, the Inquisition grew rapidly in the Kingdom of Castile. By 1492, tribunals existed in 8 Castilian cities, Avila, Córdoba, Jaén, Medina del Campo, Segovia, Sigüenza, Toledo, and Valladolid. Sixtus IV promulgated a new bull categorically prohibiting the Inquisition's extension to Aragon, affirming that many true and faithful Christians, because of the testimony of enemies, rivals, slaves and other low people, and still less appropriate, without tests of any kind, have been locked up in secular prisons, tortured and condemned like relapsed heretics, deprived of their goods and properties, and given over to the secular arm to be executed, at great danger to their souls, giving a pernicious example and causing scandal to many. Henry Carmen, The Spanish Inquisition, a historical revision according to the book A History of the Jewish People, In 1482 the Pope was still trying to maintain control over the Inquisition and to gain acceptance for his own attitude towards the new Christians, which was generally more moderate than that of the Inquisition and the local rulers. In 1483, Jews were expelled from all of Andalusia. Though the Pope wanted to crack down on abuses, Ferdinand pressured him to promulgate a new bull, threatening that he would otherwise separate the Inquisition from church authority. Sixtus did so on the 17th of October 1483, naming Thomas de Torquemada Inquisidor General of Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia. Torquemada quickly established procedures for the Inquisition. A new court would be announced with a 30-day grace period for confessions and the gathering of accusations by neighbors. Evidence that was used to identify a crypto-Jew included the absence of chimney smoke on Saturdays, or the buying of many vegetables before Passover, or the purchase of meat from a converted butcher. The court could employ physical torture to extract confessions once the guilt of the accused had been established. Crypto-Jews were allowed to confess and do penance, although those who relapsed were executed. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII attempted to allow appeals to Rome against the Inquisition, which would weaken the function of the institution as protection against the Pope, but Ferdinand in December 1484 and again in 1509 decreed death and confiscation for anyone trying to make use of such procedures without royal permission. With this, the Inquisition became the only institution that held authority across all the realms of the Spanish monarchy and, in all of them, a useful mechanism at the service of the crown. The cities of Aragon continued resisting, and even saw revolt, as into rule from 1484 to 1485. The murder of Inquisidor Pedro Arbaez in Zaragoza on the 15th of September 1485, caused public opinion to turn against the conversos and in favor of the Inquisition. In Aragon, the inquisitorial courts were focused specifically on members of the powerful converso minority, ending their influence in the Aragonese administration. The Inquisition was extremely active between 1480 and 1530. Different sources give different estimates of the number of trials and executions in this period. Some estimate about 2,000 executions, based on the documentation of the autos de fe, the great majority being conversos of Jewish origin. He offers striking statistics: 91.6% of those judged in Valencia between 1484 and 1530, and 99.3% of those judged in Barcelona between 1484 and 1505 were of Jewish origin. Censorship as one manifestation of the Counter-Reformation, the Spanish Inquisition worked actively to impede the diffusion of heretical ideas in Spain by producing indexes of prohibited books. Such lists of prohibited books were common in Europe a decade before the Inquisition published its first. The first index published in Spain in 1551 was, in reality, a reprinting of the index published by the University of Leuven in 1550, with an appendix dedicated to Spanish texts. Subsequent indexes were published in 1559, 1583, 1612, 1632, and 1640. Included in the indices, at one point, were some of the great works of Spanish literature, but most of the works were religious in nature and plays. A number of religious writers who are today considered saints by the Catholic Church saw their works appear in the indexes. At first, this might seem counterintuitive or even nonsensical. How were these Spanish authors published in the first place if their texts were then prohibited by the Inquisition and placed in the index? The answer lies in a process of publication and censorship in early modern Spain. Books in early modern Spain faced pre-publication licensing and approval by both secular and religious authorities. Once approved and published, the circulating text also faced the possibility of post hoc censorship by being denounced to the Inquisition, sometimes decades later. Likewise, as Catholic theology evolved, once prohibited texts might be removed from the index. At first, inclusion in the index meant total prohibition of a text. This proved not only impractical and unworkable, but also contrary to the goals of having a literate and well-educated clergy. Works with one line of suspect dogma would be prohibited in their entirety, despite the orthodoxy of the remainder of the text. In time, A compromise solution was adopted in which trusted Inquisition officials blotted out words, lines or whole passages of otherwise acceptable texts, thus allowing these expurgated editions to circulate. Although in theory, the indexes imposed enormous restrictions on the diffusion of culture in Spain, some historians argue that such strict control was impossible in practice and that there was much more liberty in this respect than is often believed. And Irving Leonard has conclusively demonstrated that, despite repeated royal prohibitions, romances of chivalry, such as Amadis of Gaul, found their way to the New World with the blessing of the Inquisition. Moreover, with the coming of the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, increasing numbers of licenses to possess and read prohibited texts were granted. Despite the repeated publication of the indexes and a large bureaucracy of censors, the activities of the Inquisition did not impede the development of Spanish literature siglo de oro, although almost all of its major authors crossed paths with the Holy Office at one point or another. Among the Spanish authors included in the index are Bartolomé Torres Haro, Juan de la Encina, Jorge de Montemar, Juan de Valdez and Lope de Vega, as well as the anonymous Lazarillo de Tormes and the Cancionero General by Hernando del Castillo. La Celestina, which was not included in the indexes of the 16th century, was expurgated in 1632 and prohibited in its entirety in 1790. Among the non-Spanish authors prohibited were Ovid, Dante, Rabelais, Ariosto, Machiavelli, Erasmus, Jean Bodin, Valentine Ayabod and Thomas More. One of the most outstanding and best-known cases in which the Inquisition directly confronted literary activity is that of Fray Luis de Leon, noted humanist and religious writer of Converso origin, who was imprisoned for 4 years for having translated the Song of Songs directly from Hebrew. Some scholars state that one of the main effects of the Inquisition was to end free thought and scientific thought in Spain. As one contemporary Spaniard in exile put it, our country is a land of pride and envy. Barbarism? Down there one cannot produce any culture without being suspected of heresy, error and Judaism. Thus silence was imposed on the learned. For the next few centuries, while the rest of Europe was slowly awakened by the influence of the Enlightenment, Spain stagnated. This conclusion is contested. The censorship of books was actually very ineffective, and prohibited books circulated in Spain without significant problems. The Spanish Inquisition never persecuted scientists, and relatively few scientific books were placed on the index. On the other hand, Spain was a state with more political freedom than in other absolute monarchies in the 16th to 18th centuries. The apparent paradox gets explained by both the Hermeticist religious ideas of the Spanish Church and monarchy, and the budding seed of what would become enlightened absolutism taking shape in Spain. The list of banned books was not, as interpreted sometimes, a list of evil books but a list of books that lay people were very likely to misinterpret. The presence of highly symbolical and high-quality literature on the list was so explained. These metaphorical or parable-sounding books were listed as not meant for free circulation, but there might be no objections to the book itself and the circulation among scholars was mostly free. Most of these books were carefully collected by the elite. The practical totality of the prohibited books can be found now as then in the library of the Monasterio del Escorial, carefully collected by Philip II and Philip III. The collection was public after Philip II's death and members of universities, intellectuals, courtesans, clergy, and certain branches of the nobility didn't have too many problems to access them and commission authorized copies. The Inquisition has not been known to make any serious attempt to stop this for all the books, but there are some records of them suggesting the King of Spain to stop collecting grimoires or magic-related ones. This attitude was also not new. Translations of the Bible to Castilian and Provençal had been made and allowed in Spain since the Middle Ages. The first preserved copy dates from the 13th century. Like the Bible of Cisneros, they were mostly for scholarly use, and it was customary for laymen to ask religious or academic authorities to review the translation and supervise the use. Beyond its role in religious affairs, the Inquisition was also an institution at the service of the monarchy. The Inquisitor General, in charge of the Holy Office, was designated by the Crown. The Inquisitor General was the only public office whose authority stretched to all the kingdoms of Spain, except for a brief period during which there were two Inquisitors General, one in the Kingdom of Castile, and the other in Aragon. Auto de Fe, Plaza Mayor in Lima, Viceroyalty of Peru, 17th century. The Inquisitor General presided over the Council of the Supreme and General Inquisition, created in 1483, which was made up of 6 members named directly by the Crown. Over time, the authority of the Suprema grew at the expense of the power of the Inquisitor General. The Suprema met every morning, except for holidays, and for 2 hours in the afternoon on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. The morning sessions were devoted to questions of faith, while the afternoons were reserved for minor heresies, cases of perceived unacceptable sexual behavior, bigamy, witchcraft, etc. Below the Suprema were the various tribunals of the Inquisition, which were originally itinerant, installing themselves where they were necessary to combat heresy, but later being established in fixed locations. During the first phase, numerous tribunals were established, but the period after 1495 saw a marked tendency towards centralization. In the Kingdom of Castile, the following permanent tribunals of the Inquisition were established: 1482 in Seville and in Córdoba, 1485 in Toledo and in Llerena, 1488 in Valladolid and in Murcia, 1489 in Cuenca, 1505 in Las Palmas, 1512 in Logroño, 1526 in Granada, 1574 in Santiago de Compostela. There were only 4 tribunals in the Kingdom of Aragon, Zaragoza and Valencia, Barcelona, and Mallorca. Ferdinand the Catholic also established the Spanish Inquisition in Sicily, housed in Palermo, and Sardinia, in the town of Sassari. In the Americas, tribunals were established in Lima and in Mexico City and, in 1610, in Cartagena de Indias. Initially, each of the tribunals included 2 inquisitors, calificadores, an alguacil, and a fiscal. New positions were added as the institution matured. The inquisitors were preferably jurists more than theologians. In 1608 Philip III even stipulated that all inquisitors needed to have a background in law. The inquisitors did not typically remain in the position for a long time. For the court of Valencia, for example, the average tenure in the position was about 2 years. Most of the inquisitors belonged to the secular clergy and had a university education. The fiscal was in charge of presenting the accusation, investigating the denunciations, and interrogating the witnesses by the use of physical and mental torture. The calificadores were generally theologians. It fell to them to determine whether the defendant's conduct added up to a crime against the faith. Consultants were expert jurists who advised the court in questions of procedure. The court had, in addition, 3 secretaries, the notario de sequestros, who registered the goods of the accused at the moment of his detention, the notario del secreto, who recorded the testimony of the defendant and the witnesses, and the escribano general, secretary of the court. The alguacil was the executive arm of the court, responsible for detaining, jailing, and physically torturing the defendant. Other civil employees were the nuncio, ordered to spread official notices of the court, and the alcaide, the jailer in charge of feeding the prisoners. In addition to the members of the court, 2 auxiliary figures existed that collaborated with the Holy Office, the familiars and the commissarios. Familiars were lay collaborators of the Inquisition, who had to be permanently at the service of the Holy Office. To become a familiar was considered an honor, since it was a public recognition of limpieza de sangre, Old Christian status, and brought with it certain additional privileges. Although many nobles held the position, most of the familiars came from the ranks of commoners. The commissioners, on the other hand, were members of the religious orders who collaborated occasionally with the Holy Office. One of the most striking aspects of the organization of the Inquisition was its form of financing. Devoid of its own budget, the Inquisition depended exclusively on the confiscation of the goods of the denounced. It is not surprising, therefore, that many of those prosecuted were rich men. That the situation was open to abuse is evident, as stands out in the memorandum that a converso from Toledo directed to Charles I, "Your Majesty must provide, before all else, that the expenses of the Holy Office do not come from the properties of the condemned, because if that is the case, if they do not burn they do not eat. During the reign of Charles IV of Spain, in spite of the fears that the French Revolution provoked, several events accelerated the decline of the Inquisition. The state stopped being a mere social organizer and began to worry about the well-being of the public. As a result, the landholding power of the church was reconsidered, in the señoríos and more generally in the accumulated wealth that had prevented social progress. The power of the throne increased, under which Enlightenment thinkers found better protection for their ideas. Manuel Godoy and Antonio Alcalá Galiano were openly hostile to an institution whose only role had been reduced to censorship and was the very embodiment of the Spanish black legend, internationally, and was not suitable to the political interests of the moment, the Inquisition. Its old power no longer exists. The horrible authority that this bloodthirsty court had exerted in other times was reduced. The Holy Office had come to be a species of commission for book censorship, nothing more. The Inquisition was first abolished during the domination of Napoleon and the reign of Joseph Bonaparte. In 1813, the liberal deputies of the Curvas of Cadiz also obtained its abolition, largely as a result of the Holy Office's condemnation of the popular revolt against French invasion. But the Inquisition was reconstituted when Ferdinand VII recovered the throne on the 1st of July 1814. Juan Antonio Laurent, who had been the Inquisition's general secretary in 1789, became a Bonapartist and published a critical history in 1817 from his French exile, based on his privileged access to its archives. Possibly as a result of Laurent's criticisms, the Inquisition was once again temporarily abolished during the 3-year liberal interlude known as the Trienio Liberal, but still the old system had not yet had its last gasp. Later, during the period known as the Ominous Decade, the Inquisition was not formally re-established, although, de facto, it returned under the so-called Congregation of the Meetings of Faith, tolerated in the dioceses by King Ferdinand. On the 26th of July 1826, the Meetings of Faith congregation condemned and executed the schoolteacher Cayetano Ripoll, who thus became the last person known to be executed by the Inquisition.